Hey everybody, Questwise here, and today is going to be part one of our look at Rifts Australia. It's been the beginning of a series where I'm going to explore, this is kind of part two of a series of a bunch of videos that I'm going to explore the lands of Rifts, the world books, if you will. We talked about England for a couple of videos. We're going to branch out. I'll probably go back to Australia, or excuse me, back to Atlantis. Even though I've been there and I've done a video on that before, I think I want to go back. There's been a lot of call for going back to Atlantis. So I'll probably re-explore that, and we're going to talk about Russia and Sovietsky and a bunch of others. But today is going to be part one of Rifts Australia, and the more that I delve into this books again, I think this might be minimum 2 parts, but I'm thinking maybe 3-part series on Australia itself, because there's a lot of stuff crammed into this book. We're going to cover a very small portion of the beginning of this book today, but again, still a lot of stuff, a lot of great stuff. I was super excited. I've had this book for several years, but I was super excited to get this. I've always been really interested in Australia itself. The land, the culture, the history of Australia, the fact that it's on the other side of the world from where I am at, has always been sort of a mystery and sort of a draw of inspiration for me. One of my favorite books, one of the first Palladium books that I started to own after I got TMNT and Other Strangeness, was Mutants Down Under. And I love the concept of that, and then all the interesting things inside that book. So I was really excited to check this out. Now, the greatest thing about Rifts Australia is this was written by Ben Lucas. He is an actual Australian, and I appreciate that, because to me that means he has credibility. He not that somebody else couldn't have written this book just as well, but I think that because he's Australian and he's lived there, and he knows the land, he knows the people, he knows the the mythologies and stuff that arise from that area. So I'm very excited that Ben Lucas was able to write this book, because it gives it a sense of sort of uniqueness and credibility to his pulls. So the first thing that we come to in this book are the massive changes that have happened to the continent of Australia after the coming of the Rifts. Horrible things have happened to this land. Beyond just a major loss of population and the coming of the ley lines and such, almost the entirety of the continent has now, because the sea levels have risen, and with the reemergence of Atlantis and all the activity and magical activity and ley lines emerging, the entire center of the Australian continent is now underwater, and was what is called or referred to in this book as the Inland Sea. So the geography of Australia has changed majorly since our current time period. And there's some great maps inside this book as well, or illustrations of showing how the geography has changed, and how that's affected sort of the life of the people there that have survived. The population was diminished greatly, and it's sort of reverted back to its sort of original Aboriginal and Outback sort of settings. And the Outback is a very big pull of this part of the game. There's huge sections of areas where you'll never find anybody, that are either too infested with demons and or DBs, or just unlivable, and so you might travel for days or maybe even weeks before you actually encounter other people. Now in this book, the ley lines are actually referred to as songlines by the original Aboriginal people that live there, that have survived the apocalypse, the coming of the Rifts, by sort of reverting to their original sort of lifestyles, and have escaped a majority of the punishing effects of the coming of the Rifts. There's also a lot of ley line nexuses or songline nexuses that happen in Australia. One of them is Ayers Rock, which is was a huge landmark pre-Rifts days, is now sunken underwater. There's a nexus that creates a giant whirling pool of water, and it constantly is feeding the continent with strange creatures and horrible demons and stuff as well too. The other big thing is that Australia has always been sort of this way, less so in the modern world, but it's very inaccessible. It's very cut off from the rest of the world, and even more so now in the world, the land of rifts. After the coming of the rifts, after the apocalypse and stuff, it is such a isolated place that it has really no contact with the rest of the world. So you're not really going to find coalition soldiers here. You're not going to find a lot of the stuff that you find in other Rifts Worldbooks, which I think is really awesome. It allows Australia to sort of grow and reemerge and rebirth itself in its own image and its own ways. It's very unique from a lot of the other books where there's a lot of crossover between things. Europe is a huge area that's all interconnected. So a lot of the world books that we'll look at in the future, you'll see a lot of crossovers between things. You'll see a lot of trade from the NGR. You'll see a lot of trade from the coalition. You'll see a lot of trade from a lot of other sources because of the interaction between peoples. But Australia is very unique in the fact that it is sort of isolated by itself. Now, it's not to say that you can't bring characters from a different place over, right? One of my original games using Australia was that our players from North America actually entered a rift and was transported to Australia and showed up, and then trying to explore and survive in a world that's completely alien and completely different from anything that they were used to here. There's also a huge lack of resources in post Rifts Australia. Life is very, very hard, and it can be very difficult. So that can be a very major part of your game, is actually survival as part of the campaign setting, because it's an important part. It's important to note that water is scarce, fresh drinking water is scarce, and that food and other resources are very hard to come by. And so unless you live, and we'll get into these cities later, but there are two major cities that have basically become city-states into themselves. They've walled themselves off and are completely inaccessible to people from the outside. And unless you're like that, resources and food and water and stuff are going to should be a major part of your campaign, in which you're using those to further the campaign. It's more of a survival type thing, as well as some of the other stuff that we'll get into further into this book too, demons and DBs and gangers and all sorts of stuff. The next section of this book that pops up is Outback Communities, and this is a section which is very similar to, if you're familiar with Ninjas and Super Spies, building a spy agency, or if you're familiar with other Rifts books like Mercenaries, building a mercenary company. It's very, very similar in the structure, the setup, everything is very, very similar to that, in which you decide you're building an outback community, right? You're building a small village, a town that lives in the outback, that survives in the outback by sort of safety in numbers. But this section actually helps you determine the population and water sources, access to food, biases towards other people. If you're accepting of DBs and non-native type people, there's access to technology, and you'll come up with a sheet, almost like kind of a playbook of your community and the things that you have access to, the characters have access to, and it can make it almost a home base for your characters in a campaign. And I really love it. I was first introduced to it into the spy agencies and Ninjas and Super Spies, and I thought that was a fantastic way of setting up a thing. You're going to come up with a bunch of descriptions and number levels to where your communities are, how much access to weapons you have, and technology, and food, and resources, and for spy agencies, like vehicles and outfits and that kind of stuff as well too. And so it does the same thing in Rifts Australia, and it's a really, really cool section, and it really kind of gives a nice home base to your characters, but also places that they can visit that are outside of their home base. In addition to, it just kind of gives a lot of flavor to the game and gives you a little bit more of a solid idea of what the community that you're sort of basing your campaign in is like, and what they have access to if that ever comes up in your games and such. Next week, hopefully, we're going to focus on all the occupational character classes, the OCCs in this book, and there's a huge chunk of them. So I wanted to give them their own video, their own time, their own respect to that. So next time we'll be focusing on that, and then after that we'll probably finish up the book and we'll be talking a little bit more about the land, some adventure seeds, and a lot of the creatures that are unique to Australia. So until next time, I'm Questwise. I'm out. Stay safe and game on, my friends.